Government Affairs team, second in a series of webinars on IIJA. The presentation will last about an hour. We invite you to join other attendees at a table in the lounge area for discussions after the program. My name is Mark Shade. I am APWA's Government Affairs Media Manager. Before we begin the presentation, let's look at some of the key features of the platform to help you maximize your event experience. A recording of today's program will be available on the APWA U.S. Infrastructure Law Resources for Public Works webpage. You're looking at it now. Find it at apwa.net. To better view the presentation, please click the black square with arrows located on the right side of the stage to go to full screen. You can express your likes, claps, laughs, and love throughout the session by clicking on the emoticons under the speaker frame. This is a great way to give instant feedback. As Zach and Ryan speak, feel free to engage them in a variety of ways. The right-hand navigation menu is where you'll find the communication and engagement opportunities within the platform. Use the chats area to chat publicly with all attendees in the session, and we see that you have been doing that, so that's cool. To message Zach or Ryan privately, find them in the attendee list under the people icon, then click on their profile icon. Your private chats will appear under messages. Click the X in the upper right-hand corner to return to the chats, Q&A, and polls window. If you have questions for our speakers, submit questions in the dedicated Q&A on the right panel. Really like a question someone else has posed? Upvote it by clicking the up arrow in the question box. You can do this anytime throughout the program. We will answer all questions during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Before we get to Zach, well, I should say handouts for this program are available for download from the Alerts tab on the right panel. Before we get to our main speaker, we'd like to publish a poll. All right, we'll give it a couple more seconds. And we will close the poll. Close one. Thank you. Our main speaker today is Zach Schaefer. Zach is Senior Advisor to EPA's Assistant Administrator for the Office of Water, Radeke Fox. Prior to joining EPA, Zach was the founding Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director at United for Infrastructure and Senior Policy Director for the Council on Competitiveness. Thanks for joining us, Zach. The AirMate stage is yours as soon as I switch out of this PowerPoint and get you back to your PowerPoint.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me okay, Mark?
We can hear you, yes, and we can
Excellent. All right, well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks to APWA for having me. It's great to be here with you. I'm seeing some familiar names and some familiar locations in the attendee list, so excited to be here with all of you. As Mark mentioned, I'm Zach Schaefer. I'm Senior Advisor to Assistant Administrator Fox in EPA's Office of Water. I did serve for many years prior to this role as the CEO of United for Infrastructure, working to bring together public works agencies, state and local governments, the business sector, labor organizations, and many more to advocate for increased investment in infrastructure. And I'm proud that APWA was a real core part of that effort. This does feel like coming home to a great extent. I'm also excited that at EPA, And what we're going to be talking about is funds and resources through the bill. We have a fantastic new addition to our team, who is a former APWA member. Karen Detmer is our managing director for infrastructure program implementation, and served prior to this as director of public works for the city of Milwaukee. And is just it's wonderful to have that public works perspective inside the Office of Water as we are implementing these resources, and really making sure that as we do so, we're making everything as accessible and implementable as possible from the perspective of all of you and the people you serve. If we go to the next slide, Mark. So just a quick disclaimer. So I'm going to go through a lot of information fairly quickly. I've tried to streamline it for clarity and efficiency. Just this is a disclaimer that that we have to put up, that none of the information in here is a substitute for the guidance or implementation procedures or memorandum that EPA has released for these programs. Next slide. All right, so just to give you a sense of what we're going to go through today, I'm going to try and do this in less than 30 minutes and then leave time for questions. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview of EPA and the Office of Water, and then the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and what's in it for water. Then I'm going to really dig down and focus on the state revolving loan funds, because I think that that's sort of the really core program and bill that is of relevance and opportunity for public works agencies. I will touch on our other grants and the place-based programs funded in bill, but I'll go through that a little bit more quickly. I'll talk about the federal cross-cutters that are some requirements that apply to the bill funds, and we'll talk a bit about climate and equity as well. If we can go to the next slide. All right, and next slide. So just at a very high level, just to step back and think about sort of what EPA is here to do. EPA's mission is to protect human health and the environment, and we do that through a number of different ways, which I'll go through on the next slide. But our mission is to make sure that every American has clean air, clean land, and water, that we're reducing environmental risks, that we're reducing the disproportionate burden on disadvantaged communities and historically underserved communities of pollution and those compounding challenges that many communities can face. That we're developing and providing the best science to inform regulatory decision making and our infrastructure decision making. So we have there's a lot of things that that's within our mission to do. If we can go to the next slide. How we do it is that we, as many of you know, EPA is a regulatory agency. We develop and we enforce regulations. I'm sure many of you are familiar with our lead and copper rule, our effluent limitations guidelines, other standards and rules that we set and develop. But we are also an infrastructure agency. We distribute grants and other funding resources that Congress gives to us. And from the perspective of water, those are mostly federal state partnerships where EPA is the overseer of the funds, but the programs are administered at the state level. We do a lot of research and study environmental and public health issues and incorporate that science into our rulemaking and into our grants and funding resources. And then we have partnerships and outreach and engagement to help educate people and provide information that's important to protect the environment and to protect people's health. Thanks for moving to the slide. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, was signed by President Biden last November. It is a historic investment of more than $1.7 trillion in our nation's infrastructure. The EPA, through it, received $60 billion to address water, air, and land cleanup issues, and to ensure that we can build a safer, healthier, and cleaner environment and communities. It includes $50 billion to strengthen the nation's drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. This is the largest single investment in water infrastructure that the federal government has ever made, and really the largest single investment in water that has ever been made in the nation. Approximately 85% of those funds, about over $43 billion of this funding, flow through the existing clean water and drinking water state revolving loan fund or state revolving funds. And I'll dig into those in just a moment here. So next slide. Before we get into the SRFs, just to provide a more granular view of what's in the bill for water at EPA, because there are other agencies that do focus on water, like the Bureau of Reclamation, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that also receive money in the bill for their programs, but I'm focusing here on EPA's water investments. So for drinking water, this is broken up, hopefully more in line with the functions that you all serve. So on the drinking water side, there's $15 billion through the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund for lead service line replacement, including inventories. There's nearly $12 billion in what's called a general supplemental. It's just additional SRF funding on top of the annual SRF funds. So for all of the eligibilities that you've all enjoyed through the Drinking Water SRF, there's a $4 billion pot of SRF funding set aside to specifically address emerging contaminants such as PFAS. And then there's a new grant program that is not an SRF program, but it will be state administered. That's an additional $5 billion to address emerging contaminants like PFAS in drinking water in small or disadvantaged communities. And we're just in the process of launching that program now. On the clean water side, there's nearly $12 billion for the Clean Water SRF in just additional funding. And then there's another $1 billion of the Clean Water SRF that's restricted, again, to addressing emerging contaminants. Next slide. Then there's a smaller but still significant pot of funds for what we're calling protecting our regional waters. So that's our geographic programs and national estuary program. So the geographic programs are large place-based programs from the Puget Sound to the Chesapeake Bay to the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast that have their own authorizing statutes. We'll go into that in a little bit, but those programs received $1.7 billion. And then our national estuary program received $132 million, and we're excited. We just rolled that funding out on this past Tuesday. And then there's a few other smaller pots of money, the Gulf of Mexico Hypoxia Action Plan and some underground carbon sequestration funds. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive on the SRFs, and this may get a little bit technical, but I think that that's okay because really, you're all in the weeds of this in your communities, and it's important that you have this information. So I'm glad to be able to share with you not just what's in the bill, but how do the SRFs work for those of you who aren't familiar. And the poll that Mark put up is really helpful to know that there are folks who are familiar with the SRFs, but there are a portion of folks here who have never applied, and that's a chief goal of ours in implementing the infrastructure bill is that we enable communities who've never applied for SRF funds to do so. So the SRFs are a state-federal partnership, and there's 51. Well, actually, there's 102 SRF programs. So each state and Puerto Rico have a drinking water SRF and a clean water SRF. And again, these are funds that flow from EPA to the states based on formulas, which I can get into in a second, to address key drinking water and clean water needs. Their mission is to reduce the cost of critical public health and environmental infrastructure. They do that by providing below market rate loans, and then in the case of Bill in particular, forgivable loans and grants to address those drinking water and clean water needs. We combine federal and state funds. There is normally a state match of 20%. In Bill, it's reduced to 10% in the first 2 years to help states access these funds more easily and more quickly, and then it reverts to 20% for the later years. Important to note that state match is waived for the lead service line and emerging contaminant funds. So flexible funding and financing is a key feature of the SRS. These are loans, grants, refinancing, loan guarantees, and technical assistance. Noting two things here relevant to disadvantaged communities, which is a key focus of our implementation, is that the bill requires 49% of the capitalization grants. This is the general supplementals, those $11.7 billion to the drinking water and clean water funds. It requires that 49% of those be provided as 100% grants or fully forgivable loans to disadvantaged communities. And then for the emerging contaminant funds, 25% of it has to be targeted to disadvantaged communities. And then, it's important to note that these are state implemented and operated. As I mentioned, there's 102 programs, 51 on the clean water side, 51 on the drinking water side. So each state has a drinking water and clean water SRF. And your primary point of contact as a public works agency is going to be the state, although we are always happy at EPA headquarters and in our EPA regions to support you and have conversations as can be helpful. So EPA provides the grant terms and conditions, we provide guidance, we provide program oversight, but the states then implement the programs and select the projects. So these are not direct grants from EPA to communities, these are grants from states to communities. A quick overview of sort of the scale and history of these programs. So the Clean Water SRF has been around for more than 3 decades. We've signed over 42,000 loans, put out nearly $145 billion in project funding. So this is all to say that this is a significant resource in the water sectors, in the water sector market for dollars to invest in water infrastructure. Next slide. On the drinking water side, it's a little bit younger, a little bit more than 2 decades old. We've signed more than 16,000 loans and put out nearly $45 billion in projects funded. So we're looking at nearly $200 billion over the lifespans of these programs. Next slide. I mentioned that these are below market rate loans. So this is a slide that it shows sort of the average SRF loan rate versus the average market rate. So you can see that it is a pretty significant savings, especially when you consider that these loans can be for up to 30 years and even up to 40 years, I think, on the drinking water side. So over time, these are really significant savings opportunities for communities and for water systems. Next slide. SRFs can serve a huge range of project sizes. So, this is just based on 2020 data, and the black is the drinking water SRF, the blue is the clean water SRF. But, we have loans that are in the thousands of dollars. We have loans that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The average is, as you can see, there's, about 4.3 million on the drinking water side and about 6 million on the clean water side. But the point is, these are very flexible tools depending, to be responsive to the types and sizes of projects that water systems need to finance. Next slide. So the kinds of assistance we have at or below market interest rate loans, like I mentioned before, long-term loans up to 30 years on the clean water side, up to 40-year loan terms available on the drinking water side for disadvantaged communities. The SRFs can be used to buy or refinance debt. They can guarantee or purchase bond insurance for local debt obligations. And then there's this additional tool called additional subsidization, which is essentially loan principal forgiveness. And through the Bipartisan infrastructure law, that subsidization has increased to that 49% of grants and forgivable loans that I mentioned. Important thing to note is that the SRFs are for investments in capital improvements. They are not eligible to be used for operations and maintenance. Now, of course, with capital improvements come lower needs for operations and maintenance, but it is an important factor to take into consideration as communities are thinking about the types of infrastructure that they're investing in and making sure that they have the capacity to operate and maintain those investments without the SRF resources. But it does, because they do provide these very affordable below market rates. It is an opportunity to really focus the SRFs on the capital improvement and your rate bases on the operations and maintenance and the repayment of those low interest loans. So just to capture who's eligible to receive SRF funds. So obviously, public works agencies, publicly owned treatment works, public water systems, those are the sort of core applicants and recipients of funds. But on the drinking water side, it's a public or private community water system. It is important to note that it's a system on the drinking water side, it's a system serving at least 15 service connections used year round, or that regularly serves at least 25 year-round residents. So this is to say that the drinking water SRF can't be used for private wells or very small groups of households on private wells. And they can also be used for nonprofit or community water systems. There are some schools around the country, especially in rural areas, that are classified as their own water system, similarly with parks, churches, et cetera. But mostly it's public water systems. On the clean water side, it's a bit more expanded. It's municipalities, state agencies, nonprofits, watershed groups. There are some in some states. There are also eligibilities for homeowners associations, and private water systems, septic systems. But again, that varies a bit state by state. Next slide. I'm not going to go through all of the eligible projects on this slide, but this is just to drive home that there are a lot of different types of projects that the SRFs can be used to fund. So, I mean, in a lot of cases, it's that core infrastructure investment in treatment, transmission, distribution, but it can be used for planning and design purposes, for system consolidation where you have a lot of smaller utilities in the same area. That's another important use of the drinking water SRF funds. On the clean water side, it's obviously centralized wastewater treatment, but also stormwater control, water reuse, efficiency, water efficiency, energy efficiency. So there's a lot of different kinds of projects that can be eligible for the SRFs. And if you're interested in learning more about that, please reach out to us or to your state SRF. Next slide. So I'm not going to go through all the details here. This is just to highlight, how much money will be available at a national level year by year throughout the 2022 to 2026 fiscal year timeframe of bill. I will say, though, that one of the really fantastic things about the state revolving fund is that they revolve. And what that means is that to the extent that the money goes out as loans, those loans are repaid back to the states, and that money is then lent out again and again and again and again. And so while we are plussing up the state programs with these additional bill resources over these 5 years, the 51% of those funds that can't go out as grants or forgivable loans, that will continue to revolve in the system for years to come. And that will be an enormous opportunity for states to increase infrastructure investment over a much longer time horizon. Next slide. So we started implementing the bill SRFs as soon as President Biden signed the law last November. In March of 2022, we issued an implementation memo that is sort of it's the green light, and it's the core guidance that governs how states and communities should spend the funds. It includes key requirements, key flexibilities, and recommendations for states as they implement the funds. So it includes, for instance, the directions about the 49% to disadvantaged communities as forgivable loans or grants. It includes things like core requirements like the federal crosscutters, such as the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard and the Build America, Buy America Act and the American Iron and Steel provisions. So I really encourage you to find that memo at epa.gov/infrastructure. May take a click or two there to get to it, but that's the sort of the core operating document for the bill SRFs. Now there are some additional guidances coming out on the lead funds and the emerging contaminant funds, but that document from March is the base guidance that everybody should digest and to understand how the program's being implemented. We mentioned these implementation priorities in that memo, and we lead with providing flexibility to meet local water needs. So this is not a highly prescriptive implementation approach, that we are leveraging the flexibilities that you saw in the different eligible recipients and eligible project types for SRF funding to ensure that communities and water systems can use those funds to meet their needs. A very, very important priority for this administration, for this EPA, and for states is to increase investment in disadvantaged communities. And we're really leaning in on that, working with states to update their definitions of disadvantaged communities. And again, that's something that each state sets its own definition under the Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Water Act. Direct each state to establish their own definition. We provide some recommendations in this implementation memo on how to define or on how to think about updating their definitions, but it's really up to the states to determine that, and then based on that definition to target that 49% of resources, or at least that 49%, to disadvantaged communities, including pockets of disadvantaged communities within the larger service territory of a public water system. And I'm happy to talk about that with you in the Q&A. We obviously, can we go back a slide? Thanks. So we also emphasize making rapid progress on lead service line replacement, addressing PFAS and other emerging contaminants. We also want to make sure that as we build new infrastructure or upgrade and update old infrastructure, that we're improving the resilience of our infrastructure to whatever the resilience challenge is that faces a particular utility. In some places, that's drought. In some places, that's flooding and storm events, or potential, or in the long run, sea level rise. In all places, that's cybersecurity. So, we want to make sure that utilities understand that they should use these funds to ensure that whatever they're investing now is going to last for as long as possible. We want to make sure that as we're making these investments, we're supporting the American workforce. We are fully aware of the challenge that utilities and water systems and public works departments are facing with the wave of retirements coming. And this is a really transformational opportunity to highlight that water jobs are good jobs, and to improve the practices around how we build infrastructure, and make sure that we're using, to the extent possible, things like community benefits agreements, where appropriate, project labor agreements, et cetera. Not requirements, but encouraging communities and water systems to think about using these tools. Cultivating domestic manufacturing. I will talk about Build America, Buy America in a little bit. I know that's very front of mind for water systems. Fully enforcing civil rights. We want to make sure that these funds are not used to discriminate or against any particular group of people. So this is something that we're doing across the agency and across the federal government, is ensuring that all the investments are compliant with the Civil Rights Act. And then we want to refine the state SRFs to build the pipeline of projects for the future, so that we're thinking about the long-term availability of these funds, and then encouraging states and communities to think about the projects that they not just have in the works now, but are planning and thinking about for the long term. Next slide. This is the general SRF application process. I'm not going to go through each step, but I encourage you to sort of review this slide afterward and look at it. I think it's really informative, particularly for the communities or water systems here who've never applied for an SRF loan. It's there's a number of steps. It feels complicated, and I'd be curious for any of the folks on the webinar who have applied for an SRF to indicate whether they feel it is a simple process or not a simple process. But effectively, this is the steps to get to an SRF loan. And the key thing to take away here is that it's important to be reaching out to and talking with your state SRF, understanding the requirements in your state, the timeline in your state, and the application cycle, so that you can develop an application, apply for those funds, get on the state's intended use plan. Each intended use plan has a public comment period. That's an opportunity for you, your constituents, or your citizens or customers to weigh in. That goes to EPA. That intended use plan that gets wrapped up and goes to EPA for review and approval. And then after that approval, the state receives a capitalization grant, and then states can start issuing loans to the projects. Next slide. I mentioned crosscutters. So there's it's called our crosscutter handbook. These are requirements that each project has to comply with. It includes things like Davis-Bacon Act prevailing wage requirements, domestic preference for certain manufactured products and goods requirements. So many of you may be familiar with the American Iron and Steel law provisions that have been in place for nearly a decade, and that we've been implementing at EPA very smoothly. There's also now the Build America, Buy America Act, which Congress passed concurrently with the infrastructure bill last year, and I'll talk about that again later. There's other requirements, such as the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, requiring that infrastructure built using federal funds, including the SRFs, be flood resilient there's a number of different ways to comply with it, elevation based, building outside the floodplain, to the extent practicable, of course, because we know that many of the projects that you work with are gravity driven, and that presents some challenges when it comes to flood management, but happy to talk through that more later. Next slide. I mentioned the Build America, Buy America Act. I know this is something that's front of mind for many water systems and public works agencies, as well as states. This is a law an act that was passed by Congress concurrently with the bill last year. It applies to all federal financial assistance that funds infrastructure. So that means all grant and loan programs from the federal government, not just EPA, not just water, but everything across the federal government. And by infrastructure, the definition is anything that's fixed, permanent, and serves the public interest. So to that extent, it includes most, if not all, water infrastructure, and the programs that we fund through the SRFs are covered under Build America, Buy America. And there's 3 different categories of requirements. There's iron and steel products. The language in it is just slightly different, but it's effectively the same as the American Iron and Steel provisions and requirements that water systems may be familiar with and that we've been implementing at EPA for a number of years. The new categories are manufactured products, which is defined by in the OMB guidance that the White House Office of Management and Budget released in April as 55% or greater of the total cost of components must be produced domestically. We will have some additional clarity coming out soon on sort of what that means, but effectively it's having your contractors track the components used in a project and ensuring that they meet that standard of 55%. And then the other piece is construction materials. So non-ferrous metals, plastics and polymers, glass, lumber, drywall, these are sort of single things. A manufactured product, an easy way to think about it as a manufactured product is something built of other things. Construction materials are sort of those single material things like it. So it will apply to PVC pipe, for instance. So this is something that we know will be a challenge and a burden in some ways for systems to comply with, but it is the law, and we are working to implement it as smoothly as possible. Next slide. So these requirements took effect on May 14th, 2022. There will be terms and conditions included in all new EPA grants, awards, and subawards. I know of interest to all of you and to APWA or waivers. So there are 2 types of waivers specified in the law and in the guidance from the Office of Management and Budget. They're called general applicability waivers, which are program-wide. So these are things like the waiver that you may have seen that we posted for public comment a few weeks ago. And we appreciate APWA's comments on it and are working to respond to those comments and adjust the waiver per many of the comments that we received. But these are waivers that apply to all projects within a program. And our goal here is to ensure in particular that projects that are already in the pipeline, that have already met certain design thresholds, do not have to go back and rebid or redesign the projects because of this law. We want to ensure as smooth implementation as possible and avoid disruption where projects are already underway. As long as we can ensure that there are certain thresholds that have been met for compliance. And then there's opportunities to develop de minimis and small projects waivers. I was just informed that those waivers were just posted on our website today for public comment. So that would exempt projects under a certain size. In the case of the small projects, it's $250,000. De minimis is designed to account for that situation where your contractor has to run to Home Depot and buy a box of nails, and we don't want them to have to think about, oh, did these nails come from a U.S. manufacturer or somewhere else? So it's a 5% of project cost threshold there. But then there are, if we can go back to slide, Mark. There are also the product and project specific waivers, and OMB, the White House, have indicated a strong preference for these in the long run. And what these are is that as we learn more, we'll be able to identify products that are readily available domestically, products that are gradually being reshored and will be available domestically, and then there will be products that are just really difficult to procure, at least at the scale necessary for the sector. And so there's an opportunity for EPA to issue product waivers. And so to the extent that you're identifying products that are just not available, we encourage you to reach out to EPA to share that information and ask for a product waiver. And then there's project specific waivers. There are certain situations where it's just infeasible to identify domestic sources for a range of products on a specific project. So each project can apply for a waiver. So there's a number of pressure release valves for the situations that arise that we and you may not be able to account for through the general applicability waivers. And then I'll just note that there is a whole of government domestic manufacturing strategy in the works led by the White House and the Made in America office to not just be issuing these requirements, but to be developing and cultivating a domestic manufacturing base for many of the products that that we use not just in the water sector, but that span across many different sectors, from electrical components and equipment to pumps and motors and products that we know are going to be in high demand from a variety of different sectors, and it would be great to increase the domestic manufacturing base here. Next slide. All right, so that's sort of what I was going to cover on the SRF programs. I'll touch quickly here on our other grant and place-based programs. So we can go to the next slide. So I mentioned earlier our new emerging contaminant grant program. This is a $5 billion appropriation that is targeted to small. It actually should be small or disadvantaged communities, not small and this is a program that is targeted to address emerging contaminants such as PFAS in drinking water. There will be a formula developed through a non-competitive grant process to all states that express interest in receiving these funds. We released a solicitation for letters of interest for states to express their interest in receiving these funds in June 2022. So this is to say that there's no action you need to take or can take just yet. We are still gathering information from states so that we can design the formula that we'll use to distribute these funds. We have an implementation memorandum coming that will discuss how the funds will be implemented, but again, they will be implemented by the states, not through the SRFs. This is different from the SRFs, but it will still be state implemented. And we hope to release those funds in the fall or winter of 2022 to the states for you to start applying for them. Next slide. I'll very briefly touch on our geographic programs. These are large place-based programs in the areas you see on the map here that address the unique needs of these watersheds. The programs are designed around a watershed. That's why you see the Gulf of Mexico one covers the whole Mississippi watershed, so it's a pretty large area. But they primarily address ecosystem restoration, environmental cleanup needs, particularly in the Great Lakes area, environmental education, climate resilience. In many places and cases, they do support projects that do planning and design work that can then go and leverage funding like the SRFs. So if you or your public works department is in one of these areas, it may be worth taking a look at the eligibilities and reaching out to those programs to see if there's anything of interest. I think this is going to be mostly for this is usually less on the drinking water side, but more on the stormwater side in particular. I think there are synergies with public works departments and communities. Next slide. Similarly, we have our National Estuary Program, which received $132 million over 5 years in the bill. This map shows where the 28 current estuaries of national significance are located along the Atlantic, Pacific, Gulf, and coasts, and in Puerto Rico. And these, similar to the geographic programs, fund ecosystem restoration, environmental cleanups, a lot of green infrastructure projects, stormwater control. These programs do work with SRFs on the stormwater and clean water side to identify places where the NEPs can help support the planning for SRF projects. And these programs are very successful at leveraging funds to the tune of, I think, about 22 to 1 currently. So again, to the extent that these are helpful for you, or if you're interested, please don't hesitate to reach out to our headquarters team, or there's also an estuary program coordinator in each of the regions where these estuaries are located. They can only fund projects in the study areas, though. Next slide. This just, well, I won't go through the details, but these are the funding levels from the bill for each of the geographic programs and the NEPs. Next slide. And then last, I'm going to talk about the Gulf Hypoxia Program. This is a non-point source pollution program primarily. It's part of an effort to bring resources to a longstanding task force that set the goal of reducing the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which is really threatening fisheries and the recreational and commercial fishing industries, as well as damaging ecosystems along the Mississippi River as well. So we started implementing that program just in May. In June, and if there's interest from any of you, please reach out. But I don't think this has as much direct relevance for public works agencies. Next slide. And then our Class 6 underground injection control program, there's $25 million for EPA to administer and $50 million to support states in applying for primacy for administering the underground injection control program for carbon sequestration. So again, not as much direct relevance for public works agencies, but another important program that we're administering through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go over our technical assistance programs. Next slide. So one of the most important things for us is that we provide support so that every community, every water system has the opportunity to apply for these funds and be competitive in developing an application. We don't want anyone to be shut out because they don't have the capacity to develop an application or to navigate the application process. So our goal is to collaborate with states, territories, and tribes to develop new technical assistance initiatives and expand existing ones to provide that support. We've launched almost $100 million in just the last few months through EPA, both through bill and non-bill funds, to start building the pipeline of technical assistance providers out in the regions and in communities, so that we know that it's not enough to just offer technical assistance and wait for people to come to us or to our technical assistance providers. We need a more affirmative approach that goes out to communities, that goes out to water systems, especially those who may not be aware about the SRFs or about the eligibilities and the opportunity for the grants and forgivable loans that are included in the bill, and gets communities to apply for them, helps hold their hand through the application process. And if we can go to the next slide, I'm not going to go through all the details, but this is just an overview of the kinds of services and technical assistance that we plan to offer, both directly through EPA and through our environmental finance centers and other external partners, to support every step of the way through planning and assessment, identifying community needs, doing community engagement, all the way through to things like construction management where necessary. So just emphasizing the technical assistance for these funds is a core priority of our approach to implementing them, to ensure that that not only are we targeting that 49% of funds to disadvantaged communities and as grants and loans, but that we're also building the pipeline of projects in those communities and setting them up to succeed in getting on a state's intended use plan. And with that, I'll stop and look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Zach. We're going to get the other PowerPoint back and we will proceed. And we will turn it over to Ryan McManus, who's our new team member at APWA Government Affairs. He's Government Affairs Manager. Ryan?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Zach. I'll try and be quick and not too repetitive. Kind of going off what Zach was just speaking to here for the past bit. We here at APWA Government Affairs are trying to take what we're hearing from the government to help you all stay informed, and in turn advocate leveraging using your expertise. So ultimately that we can see some of these things like IIJA through and turn that infrastructure into a reality. In addition, we're following funding that is tied to that bill and other bills, along with the regs that are tied to that funding often, including, as we see with PFAS, where there is creeping towards a national drinking water standard being proposed potentially by the end of this year, and then finalized sometime after that. In addition, we're following along with the Buy America waivers and with WOTUS, where there is a rule expected here in the next month. Of course, the Supreme Court will also be weighing in Sackett versus EPA in October. And then the permitting process, where Zach has highlighted that this administration is very concerned about climate and environmental justice, but also at the same time streamlining so as to ensure while we are taking those other priorities more into account, we're not holding up these projects and ultimately results are being delivered for the American people. Next slide, Mark, please. And to give a bit of background how we come to policy, this is a collaborative process. And That's why we did a member survey in January to confirm our priority areas, and we've been having ongoing discussions the past several months with members of the focusing on review and preparing here for the 118th Congress coming up in January. The board of directors will be responsible for final approval later this year, but we look forward to engaging with the next class of legislators to continue the work that has been started here through things such as IIJA. And hopefully here in Charlotte, we'll be working towards something a little more final on those points that we've discussed over the previous few months. And if you are coming to Charlotte, hopefully look forward to seeing you all down there, and would love to meet in person, talk, take any questions. And if you're not, I encourage you to subscribe to our APWA Washington report so you can continue to be kept in the loop, or join our Water Resources Info Now, where we take information and try and provide you with context and analysis that's helpful in your work. And I've also included my contact info. If you have any questions or want to share perspective or experience on the issues that you're confronting, please don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to chat and hopefully better inform our advocacy efforts. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it. We have one more little area to cover after the poll. That'll be me, but it'll be quick, and then we'll get to our discussion. Before that, we do have one more poll question for you. Excellent. Votes trickling in now. We'll give it another 10 seconds. All right. Thank you very much. More stop sharing here and get on to our last little bit. And that's basically the tools we use to keep you informed and to help you stay informed and apply for the money that you need to apply for to help your communities improve and get better. I'm just not seeing where the share is here. Maybe it's here. There it is. All right. So hopefully you can all see this. Can you see it? I can't even see myself now. All right, I'm going to do it. The IIJA resources page is new for us, but it's obviously it's been here since the arrival of IIJA. It focuses on what the infrastructure law is doing, and it offers featured resources like this webinar plus federal IIJA resources. Kind of breaks down into the new funding opportunities, and then we get to, there's transportation, there's water resiliency, which is what we're here for today, emergency management plus additional resources. The Washington Report, as Ryan said, is a weekly report when Congress is in session. It focuses on everything IIJA related, plus water, emergency management, climate, recycling. Members receive the Washington Report by electronic newsletter. The newsletter is a shorter form, but it has links to the longer format on the website. APWA members who are not receiving a newsletter, just check your email communication preferences once you log into your account. Want to know sooner what we're thinking and doing? We have an active APWA Government Affairs Twitter site at APWA Gov Affairs. Please follow us and stay up to date on everything that's going on and what we're thinking and how we're reacting. It's a fun page, nice personality, but informative first and foremost. New tool we are using is Contact Congress, and you really can sign up now as I'm talking, and you'll be done before I'm done talking. Just text PWX to 52886, and you'll get easy to follow directions to sign up for future Contact Congress alerts. We've used them in the past to thank Congress for passing IIJA, and again to urge them to fund IIJA, which didn't happen until earlier this year. We've also employed Contact Congress to ask your U.S. rep to join the House Public Works and Infrastructure Caucus, and we recently used it to query members about proposed changes to the Clean Water Act. Finally, tell your story. It's a page that is just that. Just click the Tell Your Story link down here. It doesn't have to be COVID related, but it's just a good way for you to tell your story. And that's the most important thing for a lot of us, is to share what you are actually experiencing on the ground so we can advocate for you in Washington and throughout the United States. And now it's time for our question and answer period. If you have questions for our speakers, please submit them in the Q&A panel on the right. If you really like a question someone else has posed, upvote it by clicking the up arrow in the question box. Here's one from Zach. Do you have insight into the community projects earmarks as they relate to water work? FY22 approved projects are out and waiting on FY23 lists.
Sure, happy to speak to that. I know that there is a connection, not as much to bill, but to the base. Well, so as many of you know, the recent session of Congress brought back earmarks, or they're called congressionally directed spending in the Senate, and community project funding in the House. And there's, I believe, about $840 million in water projects funded through those programs in FY22. They are, the Hill is still debating its FY23 funding package, and there are likely to be additional water projects funded through the same programs there. EPA is working to get that program up and running. As you know, there haven't been, we'll just call them earmarks to keep it simple, for about a decade. And so, but the program is, so we're effectively creating a new grant program through EPA. Now, that is to say, to the extent that your community or your water system received one of those earmarks, that's your money. There is a process to follow to get those funds. Congress directed that they essentially be treated like SRF funds, to the extent that, for instance, they have to meet the same eligibility requirements, which they already should. We did an eligibility check, but there may be further follow-up needed, and that they follow those federal cross-cutters that I mentioned, the prevailing wage requirements, domestic preference requirements, et cetera. And they'll have to, communities will have to apply through grants.gov to receive the funds. So we released a preliminary implementation memo for the community funding, or CDS funding, just a couple weeks ago. It's available on our website, and I can get the link to APWA to share. Again, this is only relevant if your community has received an earmark or does in the future. But we are working to implement them as quickly as possible. It is more similar to a direct grant from EPA. So a lot of the construction management and oversight will happen instead of happening at the state level as it does for the SRFs. It will happen through our EPA regions. So we encourage you to, and there's information in the implementation memo on who to contact at EPA. Each region has a earmarks point of contact that you can reach out to if you have one of those projects or might have one in the future to get more information. But the first place to go would be that preliminary implementation memo that includes steps that you can start taking to prepare to receive those funds, and then the actual final implementation guidance, including the specifics process to start following at grants.gov to apply for and receive those funds, will be out later this fall. And then obviously on a rolling basis in future years, to the extent that Congress includes earmarks in future funding packages.
Great, thank you. Several more questions. One from our CEO, Scott Grayson. I know you spoke about Build America, but public works directors that I speak with are very concerned about this in light of the fact that there are still serious issues with supply chain shortages on materials. You care to comment?
Yeah, we know that this is, this is, as with all new requirements, there will be some bumps in the road to getting there. We are confident that from a process perspective, EPA is one of the most sophisticated agencies out there because we've been administering AIS requirements for nearly a decade. So we do have, we have a team internally that already that works on domestic preference requirements and has been a huge asset to the rest of EPA and to the federal family, actually, as OMB has developed their implementation, the sort of cross government implementation guidance into other agencies as they develop their specific implementation procedures. Where there are those shortages, that is, a core reason why we are working to put in place those small project de minimis waivers, and also then on a case-by-case basis, product-specific waivers. So where public works departments run into repeated challenges procuring certain types of products, we have experience doing this under AIS, for instance, where we had a product waiver for stainless steel nuts and bolts that we had in place for several years until domestic manufacturing capacity was able to meet the need. So to the extent that you're running into those shortages and can provide us the awareness and the information on those shortages so that we can develop a waiver, we're really looking to all of you who are on the ground and working with your contractors and suppliers to be able to tell us, where there are those shortages because of for a variety of reasons, and also cost considerations too. There's some cost caps and pressure release valves included in the law as well.
Okay. What is EPA doing to minimize the potential burden barriers on grantees due to the seemingly excessive BABA requirements?
We know that that viewing them as excessive requirements is one way to think about it. It's also an opportunity to really build a secure and dense manufacturing supply chain for these products here. We know that will take time and that will have impacts on all communities and on all water systems. Our technical assistance initiative will help address a variety of different challenges that disadvantaged communities face, including navigating the application process for funds, which includes designing projects to account for Build America, Buy America requirements.
Okay, thanks. Are consulting firms able to qualify to provide technical assistance under the program?
I would want to go back and check with our staff on that. My understanding is generally not directly, but there may be opportunities through subcontract, subawards for specific purposes. But yes, usually it's universities or other NGOs who have different broader expertise. But I'm happy to follow up on that question.
Okay. And one final one, what agencies do you believe will be the primary subrecipients of downstream funding? The comment is there are not statewide water agencies like there are on the transportation side.
Well, the SRF, for the SRF funds, there are. So each state has, so all 50 states and Puerto Rico each have a drinking water SRF program and a clean water SRF program. And those are housed in some states in the state's environmental Department of the Environment, in some states in their health department, particularly on the drinking water side. But so that's who the recipient of those funds is, and who administers them, at the state level. So So to the extent that we're talking about the SRF funds, there are agencies at the state level that those go to. It's environment and health.
All right. We have no other questions, so thank you for your time. Thank you, Zach and Ryan. I think we're going to do the breakout now. If you can stay, that would be great. We will all appear in the breakout room from time to time, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. I apologize. I do have to run, but thank you so much for having me, and look forward to answering questions afterwards through APWA as I can.
Super. Thank you, Zach. Thanks all for joining us.